$24 trillion. That's what's buried beneath one country's soil. Coltan, cobalt, diamonds, gold. Enough to make every single citizen a millionaire, many times over. Now here's what's actually happening there. The average person survives on less than $3 a day. That country is the Democratic Republic of Congo. And what you just heard isn't a glitch in the data. It's the whole story. There is a pattern hiding inside the global wealth map, and once you see it, you genuinely cannot unsee it. The places that should be the richest, the ones sitting on oceans of oil, mountains of diamonds, rivers of gold, are often the poorest nations on Earth. And some of the most barren, wind-blasted, resource-empty places in the world are staggeringly, absurdly wealthy. Norway, Singapore, Switzerland, rock, ice, almost nothing to dig up. Paradise nations, trapped in poverty, wastelands covered in skyscrapers. It feels completely backward, but this isn't random. It isn't bad luck. It has a name. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a nation's greatest gift can become its deadliest curse. In 1995, two economists published a study that quietly broke the model everyone was working from. Jeffrey Sachs and Andrew Warner ran the numbers on decades of global data, country by country, resource by resource. They were looking for patterns. What they found made no sense. Countries sitting on enormous natural wealth were growing slower than countries with almost nothing. The more oil, the more minerals, the more gold a country possessed, the worse it tended to perform. They called it the resource curse. And once you understand the mechanics, it stops feeling like a paradox. Think about lottery winners. Someone wins $100 million overnight, and for a while, life is a dream. Then a few years later, they're bankrupt, isolated, and more miserable than before they ever bought the ticket. The money didn't lift them up. The money broke them. The resource curse is that exact story played out across an entire nation. Millions of lives, decades of slow, grinding damage. And it all starts with something that sounds completely harmless: easy money. When oil or diamonds start flowing, the money arrives almost effortlessly. No factories, no complex workforce, no years of innovation and risk. Just dig, drill, export. And this is precisely where the trap springs. Why build anything else? Why spend decades developing agriculture, manufacturing, or technology when you can just pump oil and the cash rolls in automatically? For most governments, the answer is you don't. Every other industry gets starved of investment. Then it starts dying. Venezuela is the textbook tragedy. The country holds the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. More than Saudi Arabia, more than Canada, more than anyone. For decades, oil didn't just dominate the Venezuelan economy, it became the Venezuelan economy, accounting for over 95% of all export income. When prices were high, Venezuela was a Latin American powerhouse. Then oil prices crashed in the 2000s and 10s. And because Venezuela had built absolutely nothing else, there was no floor to land on. Hyperinflation, empty shelves. Over 7 million people, roughly 1 in 4 Venezuelans, fled the country. Venezuela didn't become poor despite its oil. It became poor because of it. But how does one industry become powerful enough to quietly suffocate everything else? It happens through a mechanism so well documented that economists gave it a name, borrowed from a country that learned this lesson the hard way. If this is your kind of rabbit hole, hit subscribe. More of this every week. In the 1960s, the Netherlands made a discovery that should have been cause for celebration: a colossal natural gas field, one of the largest ever found in Europe, sitting beneath the North Sea. The money flooded in. The Dutch guilder surged in value. That sounds like a win. It was a catastrophe. Here's why. When a currency strengthens, everything your country produces becomes more expensive for foreign buyers. Dutch electronics, Dutch machinery, Dutch manufactured goods, all of it suddenly priced out of the international market. Export orders collapsed, factories closed, workers lost their jobs. The gas boom had quietly strangled every other healthy industry, not through any dramatic event, but through the invisible mechanics of a currency grown too strong. Economists name this Dutch disease, and it ignites wherever the resource curse takes hold. Foreign cash floods in, the local currency spikes, local products become too expensive to sell abroad, foreign imports get cheap, the country stops making things and starts buying everything from overseas instead. Factories close, farms fail, the economy hollows out until only the resource sector is left standing. And the entire nation is chained to the violent, unpredictable roller coaster of global commodity prices. One bad year on the markets, when everything breaks. But Dutch disease only explains the economic damage. There's a darker layer beneath it. Resource money doesn't just warp an economy, it severs the bond between a government and its people. In a healthy country, governments run on taxes. That relationship creates a fundamental contract of accountability. If the government wastes money, fails to build schools, lets roads crumble, the people get angry. It's their money being burned. They vote, they protest, they demand better. But in a resource-rich nation, the government doesn't need its citizens' money. It sells oil to foreign powers. It funds itself directly from the ground. The people become financially irrelevant to the state. Economists call this a rentier state, a government living on rent from a hole in the earth, not from the productivity of its population. No accountability, no contract. The link breaks. And when that link breaks, spending stops being about the public good and starts being about political survival. Subsidies, bloated payrolls, loyalty purchased wholesale, governments buying time instead of building futures. Then prices crash, instant debt, instant chaos, boom, then bust over and over. Impossible to build anything lasting in that cycle. And where there's a fire hose of unaccountable cash with no one watching, there's always someone willing to steal it. Back to the Congo, $24 trillion in the ground. The coltan in your smartphone almost certainly passed through this country. The cobalt in your electric vehicle battery, diamonds, gold, minerals the modern world cannot function without. The DRC should be one of the wealthiest nations in human history. Instead, armed militias control the mines, not governments, warlords, groups running extraction operations with forced labor, using the profits to buy weapons, which they use to seize more mines. A machine designed to consume the country's own wealth in order to perpetuate the war that lets them steal more of it. The mineral wealth of the Congo hasn't built a nation. It has funded a war, continuously, for generations. And the people sitting on top of this treasure remain among the absolute poorest on the planet, not despite the wealth beneath their feet. Because of the system built to extract it, the wealth isn't missing, it's being stolen. And here's the part that's hard to sit with. The phones in our pockets, the batteries in our cars are connected to this. So I want to ask you something. If you were advising a newly resource-rich country tomorrow, what's the first thing you'd tell them to do? Drop your answer in the comments. Is any of this inevitable? Or is there a way out? The resource curse is not a law of nature. It is a choice. And two countries, one famous, one rarely told, made a different one. Norway, 1969. Enormous oil reserves discovered beneath the North Sea. Before spending a single krone, the Norwegian government studied what had gone wrong elsewhere. The Dutch disease, the political rot, the boom and bust cycles. And they made a deliberate decision to do the exact opposite of what every other oil-rich nation had done. Their starting point was a single idea. This oil doesn't belong to us. It belongs to every Norwegian for all time. So they built a wall between the oil money and the Norwegian economy. In 1990, they created the Government Pension Fund Global with one strict rule. The oil money gets invested abroad, not spent at home. Only a small percentage of the fund's returns can be used each year. Today, that fund is worth over $2 trillion. No Dutch disease, no boom and bust, a permanent savings account for the entire nation. Prosperity guaranteed long after the oil runs out. But Norway had a head start. Strong institutions, transparent governance, rule of law already in place before the windfall arrived. What about a country that had none of that? Botswana, 1967. 1 year after independence, one of the poorest countries in the world, almost no infrastructure, no established institutions. Then diamonds were discovered. By every historical pattern, Botswana should have collapsed. Instead, the government negotiated hard with mining companies, secured a genuine share of profits, built institutions from scratch, and invested in education and infrastructure before the money ran out. Today, Botswana has the highest sovereign credit rating in Africa, not because the diamonds were any different, because the choice was. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Some economists now argue the resource curse isn't the disease at all. It's a symptom. Venezuela and Nigeria weren't destroyed by oil. They were already fragile, institutions weak, corruption entrenched, political systems unstable. The oil didn't create those problems. It poured gasoline on a fire already burning. Norway had strong institutions. Oil made them stronger. The DRC had weak ones. Minerals made them catastrophically weaker. Same ingredient, opposite outcomes, which means the real question was never about the oil or the diamonds. It was always about the quality of the systems already in place when the money arrived. And that points to something harder. The corporations buying these resources, the wealthy nations that house them, the consumers at the end of the supply chain, we all create the demand that makes extraction profitable. We benefit from the low prices. So when a country fails to break the curse, how much of that failure belongs to us? The map of global wealth is full of these contradictions. Fertile lands trapped in poverty, barren rock covered in skyscrapers. The resource curse teaches one brutal lesson. Possessing the raw ingredients for wealth is never enough. Norway proved the curse can be beaten. Botswana proved it can be beaten even from nothing. But both also proved something harder to hear. Most countries that find oil or diamonds don't have what Norway and Botswana had. And until the world gets serious about why that is, the map won't change. If you want to understand how geography still controls where billions of people live and why some of the world's borders make no sense at all, that video is right here. Subscribe to World Unwrapped, because the world is far stranger and far darker than it looks.